I was a night shift nurse on the neurological ward of St. John's Memorial Hospital. The days could be busy, but nights were another beast. The silence felt heavier, like the weight of the whole building was pressing down on you. They say night shifts make you see things that aren't there, but I'd been doing this for long enough that I didn't buy into the ghost stories. At least, not until that night. One of my patients, Mr. Harrison, had been admitted a few weeks earlier. A severe stroke had left him in a deep coma. He was an older man, quiet, no family ever came to visit him. But there was something about him, about his room, that always made me uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, maybe just the cold that seemed to hang in the air there. Even on the warmest nights, I'd walk into his room and feel an icy draft prickling along my arms. It was a Tuesday, somewhere around 2 in the morning, the deadest hour of the night. I was finishing my rounds, moving from one dimly lit room to the next, checking on patients. I remember pausing in front of Mr. Harrison's door, hesitating for reasons I couldn't quite explain. Eventually, I took a deep breath and went in. The light was dim, barely more than a glow coming from the monitor beside his bed, casting strange shadows on the walls. And that chill was there, worse than usual. It felt like someone had left a window open in the middle of winter. I adjusted his blankets, thinking maybe he could feel the cold even in his coma, and as I did, I noticed something odd. His skin was clammy, but his forehead, it felt almost hot, like he had a fever. I checked his vitals. Everything was stable, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling. Then, out of nowhere, Mr. Harrison's eyes opened. Now let me be clear, coma patients don't just wake up. Sometimes there are flickers of movement, but not this. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, almost like he could see something the rest of us couldn't. And before I could even think to react, he started to speak. His voice was cracked, barely more than a whisper, but the words sent a chill down my spine. He's coming for me. I tried to ask him who was coming, but he just repeated the same words, each time softer, until his voice faded and his eyes closed again. I stood there, frozen, listening to the soft hum of the monitor, watching his chest rise and fall. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, but then I noticed something on the floor, right where he'd been looking. A faint shadow, stretching out from under the bed, darker than any shadow should be. I backed up, glancing over my shoulder to see if the hallway lights were casting something strange, but there was nothing, and when I looked back, the shadow was gone. I left the room, my heart racing, telling myself I'd imagined it. I had to have, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every step I took down that hall felt like I was being watched, like something unseen was trailing me just out of sight. I shook it off and returned to the nurse's station, hoping that if I kept busy, the feeling would fade. An hour passed, maybe 2, and I was finally starting to relax when the alarm on Mr. Harrison's monitor went off. The sharp, relentless beeping snapped me back to attention, and I sprinted down the hallway, the soles of my shoes slapping against the polished floor. I pushed open the door to his room, and he was gone. The bed was empty, the sheets rumpled, but there was no sign of him. For a second, I thought he'd somehow regained consciousness and wandered off, but a quick look around the room ruled that out. His IV line was still in place, and there was no way he could have managed to unhook himself without assistance. Panic started to set in, and I checked the hallway, my pulse racing, calling out his name as I moved from room to room, hoping he'd somehow wandered into one of them. But no one had seen him. No one heard anything. I went back to the nurse's station, my mind spinning, wondering how a comatose man could just vanish. Then I remembered the security cameras. If he'd left his room, maybe we'd be able to see how. I called security, practically begging them to check the footage with me. As we watched, my hands began to tremble. The footage showed me entering his room, then leaving. An hour later, it happened. The screen flickered, and there, in the dim glow of the hallway lights, a shadow moved past his door. It stopped, lingering for a few seconds, almost as if it was looking at him through the wall. Then, slowly, it slipped through the door. Just like that, 1 minute it was outside, and the next it was in his room. What happened next was even worse. Mr. Harrison's bed began to shake, not violently, but just enough that you could see it. Then, in a sickeningly smooth motion, he sat up. His eyes were open, staring blankly, his face pale, and standing beside his bed was the shadow. But it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had taken shape, the vague outline of a person, though it was too dark to make out any details. It reached out, almost like it was touching his shoulder. Then, hand in hand, they walked out of the room. I couldn't look away, couldn't believe what I was seeing. Mr. Harrison, this man who'd been in a coma for weeks, was walking down the hallway with this thing, this figure that shouldn't have been there. They moved past the nurse's station and disappeared down the far end of the hall where the camera feed cut out. Security and I replayed the footage over and over, but it was the same every time. No one could explain it. We searched the entire hospital, but Mr. Harrison was gone. No trace, no explanation. The police were called, of course, but what could they say? I told them what I'd seen, but they just chalked it up to stress or an overactive imagination. They said he'd probably found his way outside somehow, though that didn't explain the shadow or the way he just vanished. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, especially on the night shifts. The memory of his voice haunted me. He's coming for me. And now, sometimes late at night, I hear footsteps down that same hallway, the faintest echo, like someone's walking right behind me. I haven't worked a night shift in years. You can't pay me enough to go back to that hospital after dark. But every so often I think about Mr. Harrison, and I wonder where he is now, if he's even anywhere. And I wonder about the shadow that took him, if it's still lurking, waiting for its next visitor. And sometimes, in the silence, when the air turns cold, I wonder if maybe, just maybe, it's still coming for me. The first time I heard something strange, I was halfway down the hall to the morgue. It was a cold, damp night, the kind that sinks through your bones. Working the night shift as a security guard in a hospital wasn't anyone's dream job, but it paid the bills, and I'd grown used to the eerie silence that wrapped around those empty, dark hallways. I'd been assigned that wing of the building just a few nights earlier, mostly patrolling the basement levels. That included the morgue. It wasn't as bad as it sounds, at least not in the beginning. The morgue was at the end of a long, narrow corridor that was always dimly lit, no matter how many bulbs they replaced. The air in there always felt colder than the rest of the hospital. Every night, I'd steel myself before heading down that hallway, telling myself that it was just another part of the job. But that night, something changed. It was around 3 in the morning, the dead of night, when the halls were silent enough that you could hear every squeak of your shoes, every hum of the fluorescent lights. I was doing my rounds, trying to shake off the drowsiness that crept in after hours. Just as I got close to the door that led into the morgue, I heard it, a faint, almost inaudible whisper. At first, I thought it was static from my radio. I paused, listening closely, but it was still, so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe my ears were playing tricks on me. But as I turned back toward the door, I heard it again. Only this time, it was clearer. It was my name, a whisper, slow and deliberate. Tom. Now, I'm not one to scare easily, but hearing your own name in an empty hallway is enough to send a chill down anyone's spine. I laughed it off, though, figuring one of the guys might be playing a prank on me. I called out, "All right, who's there?" But my voice just echoed down the empty corridor. Silence. I took a deep breath, telling myself it was nothing. I was about to turn and walk away when I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from inside the morgue. The sound was so soft, like someone lightly knocking on a metal surface. I hesitated, my hand on the door handle, debating whether to open it. Everything in me told me to turn around, to leave the morgue alone for the night. But the curiosity got the best of me. I cracked the door open and peered inside. The room was barely lit by a single bulb that flickered every now and then, casting strange shifting shadows on the walls. The smell hit me first, that sterile metallic scent that clings to every morgue, mixed with the faint, stale smell of old, closed-off spaces. Rows of metal drawers lined the walls, each one cold and unfeeling. I kept hearing that tapping, louder now, coming from one of the drawers at the far end of the room. My gut twisted. I knew I shouldn't be doing this. I'd been warned never to disturb anything in there unless absolutely necessary. But the sound was relentless, like someone was waiting for me to answer. Slowly, I stepped inside, each step echoing as the cold seeped into my skin. The drawer kept tapping. The closer I got, the more I felt a strange sense of dread settle over me, heavy and dark. I finally stood right in front of the drawer. I could feel the chill radiating from it, sharper than the cold in the rest of the room. I reached out, hesitated for a second, and then, with a shaky hand, I pulled the drawer open. Empty. There was nothing in it, just a cold steel surface with no sign of anyone or anything that could have been making that noise. I stood there for a moment, confused, staring down into that empty space, trying to wrap my head around it. That's when I felt it. A sudden, sharp breath of icy air against the back of my neck, so cold it felt like it was searing my skin. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing. Only the dim light and the shadows dancing on the walls. I backed away, feeling my heart in my throat. I forced myself to close the drawer, but the moment I did, I heard a soft whisper again. This time, it was closer, like it was right beside my ear. "Tom, why did you leave me?" I didn't even think. I bolted out of that room, slamming the door behind me, feeling the cold fading as I ran back down the hall. I didn't stop until I was back at the security desk, where the lights were bright and the air was warmer. The rest of my shift passed by in a haze, and I left as soon as the morning crew came in. But the strangest part, no one believed me. My supervisor said it was probably the ventilation, or maybe my tired mind playing tricks on me. I tried to believe that too, tried to tell myself it was just a weird one-time thing. But from that night on, I did everything I could to avoid that hallway. The next week, I got assigned back to the morgue for the night. I dreaded going down there, but I had no choice. They needed extra security on that floor, and I was the only one available. So, reluctantly, I did my rounds as usual, keeping my head down, my eyes focused straight ahead, refusing to look at the morgue door. But just as I passed it, I heard that faint whisper again. And this time, it was unmistakable. It was my name, soft, insistent, echoing from deep inside the room. I kept walking, trying to ignore it, but the whisper turned into a murmur, growing louder, more desperate. "Tom, Tom, come back." I stopped, my hands shaking, as I felt a cold draft creeping out from under the door. And then I heard something that froze the blood in my veins. A faint laugh, low and distorted, followed by that same tapping on the metal drawers. I turned to leave, but the cold gripped me, anchoring me in place. The temperature plummeted, like an invisible hand was pressing against my back, urging me forward. I could feel something there with me, something that shouldn't have been. I tried to ignore it, to force myself to keep walking, but that whisper was so close now, so real. It was as if someone was standing right behind me, whispering in my ear, "You left me. Why did you leave me here?" My heart raced, but I forced myself to move. I stumbled down the hallway, practically sprinting back to the main floor, not daring to look back. When I reached the safety of the lighted corridor, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something. But there was nothing there, just shadows, silent and still. From that night on, I refused to go near the morgue. I managed to switch shifts, convincing my supervisor that I'd be more useful on other floors. But even though I stayed far from the basement, I could still feel it, the weight of something watching, waiting. And every so often I'd hear it again, faint and distant, a whisper drifting up from the cold depths below, calling my name like it was still looking for me. And now, whenever I pass by that part of the hospital, I still feel the chill, like the air grows heavier, colder, pressing in. I haven't told anyone else since then. Who would believe me? But some nights I can't shake the feeling that whatever was in that morgue is still waiting, calling out for someone, hoping that one day I'll answer again. The house sat alone in the middle of an open field, surrounded by a sea of tall grass that swayed with the wind, creating a strange rustling sound that made the air feel alive. It was an old farmhouse, abandoned for years, falling apart from neglect and time. I'd heard about it before, whispers from locals about strange sightings and noises late at night. I didn't believe any of it. To me, it was just a place that had been left behind. We arrived close to midnight, just a group of us looking for a bit of fun. But by 3:23 a.m., I was questioning everything I thought I knew about the world. The moon was out that night, but not just any moon. It had this eerie red tint to it, casting a bloody glow over the field. It seemed unnatural, almost too bright, and it bathed everything in an unsettling hue that made even the shadows feel alive. The whole scene was unnerving, and there was a heavy stillness in the air, like the night was holding its breath, waiting. My friend Chris was the first to step into the house. The floor creaked under his weight, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. I followed, the rest of the group trailing behind. Inside, the house was worse than I'd imagined. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, streaked with something dark I didn't want to identify. Dust coated everything, and the air smelled stale, like mildew and something metallic that lingered in the back of my throat. We started exploring room by room, calling out to each other in hushed voices that barely felt appropriate in the silence. I remember feeling a strange sensation as we moved deeper into the house, a pressure building in my chest, a feeling that something was off. But it wasn't until later that I understood why. Around 3 a.m., we heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound echoing from somewhere within the house. Footsteps, slow, steady, deliberate. At first I thought one of my friends was trying to scare the rest of us, but when I looked around I saw the same fear mirrored on everyone's face. No one was moving. No one was making a sound. The footsteps continued, moving closer, and yet there was no sign of anyone. It felt like the sound was coming from all around us, filling the walls, vibrating through the floorboards. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel a chill running down my spine as I strained to listen, trying to pinpoint the source. And then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps stopped. A thick silence fell over the room, so heavy it felt like we were all being crushed under its weight. I tried to laugh it off, making a weak joke to break the tension, but my voice sounded wrong, too loud and out of place in the quiet. It was Chris who pointed it out first. "Do you feel that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, like the air's buzzing or something. At first, I thought he was just spooked, but then I felt it too. It was subtle, a faint hum, like a low-frequency vibration that seemed to pulse through the house. I glanced at my phone, checking the time without even thinking. 3:23 a.m. The exact moment I looked, I saw it. The battery on my phone, which had been fully charged, suddenly dropped to 0, and the screen went black. Confused, I looked around and saw that the same thing had happened to everyone else's phones. Whatever it was affecting everything. The hum grew stronger, and with it came an overwhelming feeling of dread. A sense that we were intruding on something ancient, something that didn't want us there. I wanted to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in that house, unable to break free. And then we heard it again. Footsteps, louder this time, moving faster, almost like someone or something was running. The sound came from above, on the second floor, even though the house was too dilapidated to have a second level anymore. The footsteps echoed, pounding against the non-existent floor, sending vibrations through the walls. It felt like the entire house was alive, pulsing with each step, and I could feel my heart racing, pounding in time with the sound. "Let's get out of here," someone muttered, their voice trembling. But as soon as we turned to leave, the footsteps stopped again, replaced by a new sound, a faint, whispering voice that seemed to drift from the corners of the room, soft and unintelligible, like it was speaking a language we couldn't understand. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin, and every instinct told me to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. And then I saw it, a shadow flickering in the dim moonlight, barely visible through the window. It was faint, just a smudge of darkness against the red glow, but it was there, moving, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and suffocating, wrapping itself around me like a shroud. We stumbled out of the house, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as we ran across the field, the tall grass scratching against our legs. When we finally reached the edge of the property, I turned back, expecting to see the house standing there, empty and silent as ever. But it wasn't. Instead, in one of the windows, I saw a faint outline, a dark figure, standing there, watching us with eyes that glowed faintly in the moonlight. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. We left without looking back, without saying a word to each other. None of us could explain what we'd seen, and honestly, I don't think any of us wanted to try. To this day, I can still hear those footsteps in my mind, that faint, rhythmic pounding that filled the house and echoed in my bones. Sometimes late at night, I'll catch myself listening, straining to hear them again. I don't consider myself superstitious. Ghost stories, urban legends, even paranormal encounters, they've never had much of an effect on me. But one night changed everything, leaving me with a lingering fear that I still haven't been able to shake. It was a late evening, the kind where you don't really notice the passing of time until it's suddenly dark outside. I was working alone at my desk, my apartment silent except for the occasional hum of traffic from the street below. It was comforting, in a way, knowing I was safely tucked away from the bustling world outside, lost in my own little bubble. But that night, my sense of security shattered. It started with a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. My desk faced away from the window, but the faint reflection on my computer screen showed just enough for me to notice. It was subtle, like someone passing by the window, a dark shape moving quickly through the periphery of my vision. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just a trick of the light, or maybe a stray bird flying by. But then I saw it again, more clearly this time, a figure faint and shadowy passing by the window, moving slowly, almost deliberately. I turned, hoping to catch a better look, but by the time I faced the window, there was nothing there. Just the night outside, still and quiet. I shook my head, laughing it off nervously. It's nothing, I told myself, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I sat there trying to focus on my work, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and an uncomfortable sensation washed over me, like someone's gaze was fixed on me from just beyond the glass. I glanced back at the window, this time cautiously, half expecting to see nothing. But what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. There, faint and shadowy, was the outline of a person, a dark figure standing just beyond the window, perfectly still, watching me. I froze, my heart pounding as I stared at the shape, trying to make out any details, but it was just a blur of darkness. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out any features. It was as if the figure was intentionally shrouded, hidden in a way that seemed unnatural. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure faded away, vanishing into the shadows as if it had never been there. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty space beyond the window, trying to process what I'd just seen. My rational mind tried to explain it away, a shadow cast by a streetlight, maybe a trick of the reflection on the glass. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I could feel it, a sense of wrongness, a presence that had lingered just long enough to make its mark on my mind. After a few minutes, I forced myself to get up and close the blinds, shutting out the night. I told myself that everything was fine, that I was overreacting. But even with the blinds drawn, the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Finally, I mentioned it to a friend. He listened, a skeptical smile on his face, but as I described the shadowy figure, his expression grew more serious. After a moment, he told me about a theory he'd read about, something called remote viewing. He explained it as a kind of psychic ability, the power to see things from a distance, without actually being there. The idea was that someone, somewhere, could be watching me, observing me from afar. I laughed it off at first, but the thought gnawed at me, planting a seed of fear that only grew with each passing night. Was it possible that someone, or something, was using some strange ability to look in on me, to spy on me without ever being physically present? The thought was terrifying, but what could I do? I couldn't exactly call the police and tell them I was being watched by a shadowy figure with psychic powers. So I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend everything was normal. But then, one night, things escalated. I was in bed, just starting to drift off to sleep, when I felt it, a presence, close and cold, filling the room. I opened my eyes, heart pounding, and saw it. The same shadowy figure, this time standing right by my bedside, watching me. It was just as indistinct as before, a blur of darkness without any clear features, but I could feel its gaze, a piercing intensity that sent chills down my spine. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure leaned closer, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. and for a brief moment I thought I could make out a pair of eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on me. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, leaving me alone in the darkness. I sat up, gasping for breath, my heart racing as I stared at the empty space where it had been. I could still feel its presence, lingering in the air, a cold reminder of whatever or whoever had been watching me. After that night, I became obsessed. I researched everything I could find about remote viewing, psychic abilities, anything that might explain what was happening. But nothing I found brought me any comfort. Every theory, every explanation only made things worse, feeding my fear, making me feel more helpless. Weeks passed, and though I never saw the figure again, the feeling of being watched never left me. It was there in the background, a constant pressure, a weight that I couldn't shake. I started sleeping with the lights on, keeping my curtains drawn at all times, anything to block out that sense of being observed. Eventually, I moved to a new apartment, hoping that distance would put an end to it. For a while, things were quiet. The presence seemed to fade, and I almost convinced myself that it had all been in my head. But then one night, as I was settling into bed, I glanced at the window and froze. There, just faint enough to be almost invisible, was the outline of a shadow, a figure standing just beyond the glass, watching me. I'll never forget that night, and every time I think about it, I get chills all over again. It was supposed to be just a quiet evening in with my best friend Sarah. We were catching up over coffee and half watching some old movies on her couch. Her house was a cozy, old place, the kind with creaky floors and high ceilings, where shadows seemed to settle into the corners just a bit too comfortably. It was well past midnight, and the street outside was dead quiet. The wind was picking up, whistling through the branches that scraped against the side of the house. Inside, everything seemed amplified. The soft hum of the fridge, the faint ticking of an old broken clock on the mantel. Sarah had inherited that clock from her grandmother. I'd never seen it working. It was one of those antiques that looked beautiful, but was just for show. Anyway, we were sitting on the couch, wrapped in blankets, when Sarah suddenly sat up, squinting at the clock. I remember her saying, "Did you hear that?" I hadn't heard anything other than the usual creaks and groans of the house settling, so I shook my head, but she insisted. She told me she thought she'd heard a faint ticking sound coming from the clock, which of course didn't make any sense since it didn't even have batteries. So we both got up and walked over to the mantel, standing there in the dim light, staring at this clock as if it were going to explain itself. Sure enough, after a moment we heard it. Just a faint, almost hesitant tick, tick, tick. It sounded rusty, like it was coming from far away, barely there, but unmistakable. Sarah reached out, cautiously touching the edge of the clock, and the ticking stopped. We exchanged a glance, both of us trying to laugh it off, like it was just some weird fluke. We tried to convince ourselves that maybe it had a little battery juice left. Who knows how clocks work, right? But deep down, I think we both knew there was something off. We went back to the couch, trying to pretend like it didn't bother us. But the silence that settled over the room felt heavy, like the air had thickened, making it hard to breathe. Every little sound seemed amplified, the faint buzz of the streetlight outside, the rattle of the wind against the window. Then came the sound from the kitchen. It was a clink, like metal on metal. It echoed through the quiet house, loud enough to make us both jump. Sarah frowned and glanced toward the dark doorway leading into the kitchen. "Probably just the dishes shifting in the sink," she said, but I could tell she didn't believe it. Neither did I. Another clink. Then a soft scrape, like something heavy was being dragged along the countertop. It was so slow, so deliberate, that every hair on my arms stood on end. We looked at each other, both silently daring the other to go check it out. Sarah, probably trying to be brave, stood up first, motioning for me to follow. As we walked toward the kitchen, I noticed just how quiet the house had become. The fridge was silent. The hum of the streetlight outside was gone. It was as if everything had been muffled, like someone had thrown a blanket over the whole house, trapping us in this strange, unnatural silence. When we reached the kitchen, we hesitated in the doorway, staring into the darkness. Sarah fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb had gone out. Of course! she muttered, half to herself, and I could hear the nervousness in her voice. We had to rely on the dim light from the hallway behind us, which barely illuminated the edges of the counters. There was nothing out of place. The dishes in the sink were exactly where we'd left them, and the chairs were neatly tucked under the table. But the air was freezing. It was the kind of cold that felt unnatural, like it had crept in from someplace it didn't belong. Then we heard the ticking again, only this time it was coming from the kitchen. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but I couldn't move. The ticking grew louder, echoing off the tile walls, filling the room with this strange metallic rhythm that felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers ice cold, and whispered, "We need to leave, right now." I didn't argue. We turned to go back to the living room. But just as we reached the doorway, the ticking stopped. I froze, straining my ears, waiting, but there was nothing. And then, from the darkness of the kitchen behind us, came a low, hollow whisper. I couldn't make out what it said, but it was enough to send both of us running back into the living room. We shut the kitchen door behind us, as if that could somehow keep whatever it was out. We sat on the couch, breathing hard, trying to rationalize what we'd heard. Maybe it was a draft, or some old pipe knocking around. Maybe we were just imagining things. But then, the clock started ticking again. This time, it was louder, steadier, like it was counting down. We stared at it, neither of us daring to move, as the ticking grew faster and faster, echoing through the silence like a heartbeat. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. But the silence wasn't empty anymore. There was a presence in the room with us. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like a weight pressing down on us, filling the space with this terrible, cold energy. And then we both heard it, the whisper again, clear this time, coming from just behind us. "Why are you here?" I felt Sarah's grip tighten on my arm, her fingers digging in as we sat there, paralyzed. The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. It was as if the very air had frozen around us, trapping us in place. Then, from somewhere in the shadows, came a faint scraping sound, growing louder, closer. The noise was coming from behind the wall, like something was trying to claw its way out. With every scratch, I felt my heart race faster, a creeping horror clawing its way up my spine. The scratching stopped suddenly, and then, one by one, every light in the house went out. We were plunged into darkness, the only sound our own ragged breathing. We fumbled for our phones, but the screens wouldn't turn on. It was as if the house itself was swallowing us whole, trapping us in this impenetrable darkness. And then we saw it. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, we could just make out the shape of a figure standing in the corner of the room, shrouded in shadow. It was tall, its form impossibly still, watching us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing, hungry. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you see that?" I nodded, too terrified to speak. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It was just there, an unnatural presence that felt like it was drawing the very life out of the room. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the air was thick with something I couldn't see. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The lights flickered back on and we sat there, blinking in the harsh brightness, hearts pounding. Everything looked normal, like nothing had happened. But I knew we hadn't imagined it. The weight of that presence, the sound of that ticking, it was too real. Since that night, I haven't been back to Sarah's house. Every time I remember that empty gaze in the shadowy corner of her living room, I feel a chill run down my spine. Sarah doesn't talk about it much, but I know she's haunted by it too. We tried to forget, chalking it up to exhaustion, or maybe the odd creaks of an old house late at night. But deep down, we both knew that wasn't the whole story. One night, a few weeks later, I got a message from Sarah. Just one simple sentence, but when I read it, my heart dropped and my hands started shaking. "The clock is ticking again, and there's something in the kitchen." I didn't reply right away. Part of me wanted to tell her to call for help. Part of me knew I needed to go, but I couldn't shake the dread creeping over me. Still, I couldn't just leave her to face whatever was happening alone. So I grabbed my coat and got into the car, praying that this time it would turn out to be nothing. When I arrived, her house was dark, with only one light on upstairs. Sarah's room, I guessed. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. The house was quiet, wrapped in an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I rang the bell again. Still nothing. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave, but my feet moved on their own. I tried the doorknob and it turned easily. The door creaked open, the sound dragging out through the empty space like a warning. Stepping inside, the first thing I felt was the cold. It was different from any cold I'd felt before, heavy and almost alive, as if it were a presence pressing down around me. I called Sarah's name, but my voice sounded strange, swallowed up by the quiet. Then I heard it. The tick-tick-tick of that old clock on the mantel in the living room. I stopped in my tracks, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. The clock was ticking, even though we both knew it didn't have a battery. I took a deep breath and forced myself toward the sound. The living room was dimly lit, with only the faintest glow from the street lamp outside casting shadows that seemed to stretch and sway across the walls. I looked at the clock on the mantel, and my heart pounded as I saw the hands moving, ticking forward in steady, deliberate motions. Then, from the kitchen, came a soft knock, a gentle, almost patient tap that broke through the silence. It came again, like someone tapping on glass, slow and rhythmic, drawing me toward it. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't help myself. I walked to the kitchen doorway and reached for the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb must have blown. I was left with just the dim hallway light casting a pale, faint glow over the kitchen counter. Everything looked normal, but the air was freezing. It felt like something was watching me. My breath came out in little puffs, and then once again I heard that tick, 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 this time louder, like the clock was right there in the room with me. My heart pounded as I looked around, but there was nothing, just shadows shifting in the half-darkness. Then I heard a whisper, soft, chilling, and right behind me, a low, haunting voice, saying something I couldn't quite understand. I turned around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, but the whisper hung in the air, like an echo fading into the silence. Panic surged through me, and I backed out of the kitchen, nearly stumbling in my rush to get back to the living room. Just as I reached the doorway, I saw Sarah standing in the shadows. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. "You heard it too, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We stood there in tense silence, neither of us wanting to admit what we'd just experienced. I grabbed her arm, ready to get out of there, but as we stepped toward the door, the ticking grew louder. I turned, looking at the clock, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Beneath the dusty glass, within the old clock face, was a faint, shadowy outline of a face, staring out from behind the clock's glass. It was watching us, eyes empty, and as I stared, the faint hint of a smile crept onto its ghostly features. The whisper came again, so close this time it felt like someone was leaning over my shoulder, speaking directly into my ear. "Don't look back." The words were clear and unmistakable, and the voice was filled with an ancient, cold malice that chilled me to the core. I felt Sarah grip my arm, her fingers cold as ice. Without another word, we bolted for the door, not daring to look behind us. We stumbled out into the street, gasping for breath as if we'd just escaped from something deadly. Standing there under the weak glow of the streetlight, we didn't say a word. The silence between us was thick with unspoken fear, and as I looked at Sarah's pale face, I knew she'd seen it too. And then, from inside the house, faint but unmistakable, we heard one last tick, 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 like a taunting farewell or a warning that whatever we'd seen wasn't truly gone. We never went back to that house. Sarah moved out a week later, and we tried to put the whole thing behind us. But some nights, late when I'm alone, I still hear the ticking sound, soft and distant, as if it's following me, waiting in the shadows. It was an old house, the kind you could imagine in a storybook, Victorian, with narrow hallways, tall windows, and floors that creaked with every step. I'd just moved in, having found the place on the cheap. I knew it would need work, but I'd always wanted to live in a house with history, and this one had plenty. The realtor had talked about its unique charm, which I now realize was code for drafty rooms, creaky floors, and constant strange noises. The first few nights were quiet enough, though the house had an unsettling way of settling at night. I'd hear the occasional groan of the floorboards, and more often than I'd like, what sounded like footsteps. I chalked it up to the house shifting or the wind playing tricks, the usual excuses you make to keep yourself from getting spooked. But then, things started moving. The first time it happened, I was in the kitchen. I'd put a book down on the counter after dinner, some novel I was halfway through and figured I'd get back to later. But as I was washing dishes, I saw it from the corner of my eye. The book wasn't where I'd left it. It had moved a good few inches, lying open on a page I hadn't reached yet. I frowned, sure I'd closed it, and then laughed it off. Maybe I nudged it with my elbow, I muttered, though I knew I hadn't. Still, I tried to forget it, hoping it was just one of those things. A couple of nights later, I was in the small library at the back of the house, going through some of the dusty old books the previous owner had left behind. I was absorbed in flipping through them, trying to piece together the story of the people who'd lived here before me, when I heard a soft swish. At first, I thought it was just the wind again, brushing up against the side of the house. But then, I saw something that stopped me cold. There, at the edge of the bookshelf, a thick, heavy book slowly shifted out of place. It teetered for a moment, then fell to the ground with a loud thud. I froze, just staring. It's strange how, in a moment like that, you can feel both completely paralyzed and yet painfully aware of every little detail. The soft rustle of the curtains in the draft, the faint creak of the floor, the silence that followed the book's fall. Trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen a book fall by itself, I went to pick it up. My hands were shaking a little as I reached down, brushing off the dust. It was a worn, leather-bound journal, the kind you'd imagine belonging to someone from 100 years ago. There was no title on it, just a strange symbol embossed on the cover, some kind of odd, looping shape that made my skin prickle. I opened it, hoping for some kind of explanation, but the pages were blank. That seemed impossible, given how aged and worn the book looked. I tried to dismiss it, closing the book and putting it back on the shelf, forcing myself to go about the rest of my night. But that night, sleep was hard to come by. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that book falling, or hear the faint creak of floorboards, and I'd feel this sense of something lurking just out of sight. Eventually, I drifted off, only to be startled awake a few hours later by a sound I couldn't place. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I heard it again. A soft, rhythmic swish-swish, like the sound of a broom brushing against the floor. I blinked in the darkness, wondering if I'd left a window open, but there was no wind. Just that steady, eerie sound, like someone sweeping in the next room. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear over the pounding of my own pulse. The sound was coming from the hallway outside my bedroom, just beyond the door. Gathering my nerve, I slipped out of bed, quietly making my way to the door. I opened it a crack, peering into the hallway, and my heart nearly stopped. There, just a few feet from my door, was the old broom I kept in the kitchen closet, moving slowly across the floor as if being pushed by invisible hands. It moved back and forth in that same rhythmic pattern, sweeping the hallway in complete silence. I watched, frozen in place, too stunned to breathe. I kept waiting for something logical to explain what I was seeing, but nothing came. The broom just kept sweeping, back and forth, like it had a mind of its own. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I snapped out of it. I backed up, shut the door as quietly as I could, and stumbled back to bed, pulling the covers up over my head like a child. Sleep was out of the question after that, and I lay there wide-eyed, listening for every sound, waiting for the broom to start sweeping again. The next morning, I found the broom lying exactly where I'd seen it in the hallway. The floor was spotlessly clean, as if someone had spent hours meticulously sweeping it. But there was no one else in the house. I laughed it off in an attempt to comfort myself, muttering about sleepwalking, though I knew I'd never sleepwalked a day in my life. Over the next few days, the strange activity only escalated. Books would shift on their own, sliding off shelves, and landing open on pages with odd sketches and symbols. Sometimes I'd find the chairs rearranged in the kitchen, lined up in strange, almost ritualistic patterns. And every night, like clockwork, I'd hear that steady swish-swish of the broom in the hallway. I became obsessed with trying to catch whatever was doing this. I'd leave my bedroom door open, lying awake for hours, hoping to catch a glimpse of the broom or see a book move. But whatever was responsible never showed itself while I was looking. The only clue I had was the sense of a cold, unsettling presence, hovering just out of sight. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was exhausted, on edge, and frankly terrified. So I did the one thing I'd been avoiding. I opened that strange journal from the library. This time, when I flipped through the pages, the blankness was gone. Writing filled each page, scrawled in a hasty, frantic hand. The entries spoke of strange occurrences, whispers in the night, footsteps in empty rooms, and objects moving on their own. Each page was dated over 100 years ago, and each entry grew more desperate, like the writer had been slowly losing their mind. The last entry made my blood run cold. It was scrawled in a large, frantic script that was barely legible. It read, "They are not gone. They are never gone. I can see them, waiting in the shadows, moving the things I hold dear, reminding me that this house is theirs." I slammed the book shut, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Every story, every strange noise, every inexplicable movement felt like it was closing in on me. This house was theirs, whoever they were, and they were making it clear that I was not welcome. The silence that followed was so thick, so oppressive, it felt like a weight pressing down on me. And then, as if to punctuate the point, the broom began to sweep again. This time, the sound was slower, deliberate, as if mocking me, letting me know that no matter what I did, they were still here. I bolted, grabbing only what I could carry, and ran out of that house, leaving the door wide open behind me. As I stumbled onto the street, I dared to look back, and there, in the window, I saw the faint outline of a figure watching me go. I could have sworn I saw the broom in its hand, moving back and forth, sweeping in a slow, eerie rhythm. I thought leaving the house would be the end of it. I told myself that once I walked away, once I put that old place behind me, the nightmare would be over. I found a new apartment, smaller, modern, with bright lights and no creaky floors, a place that felt nothing like the house. But it didn't take long to realize that whatever I'd left behind hadn't let go of me. The first few nights in the new apartment were quiet, and I started to believe it was truly over. I was finally sleeping again, starting to feel at ease. But one night, as I lay half asleep, I heard a soft, rhythmic swish-swish. It was faint, so quiet it could have easily been a breeze outside. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my nerves. But then, slowly, the sound grew louder. Wide awake, I lay there, clutching the sheets, hoping, praying that it would stop. But it didn't. It just kept going, steady and deliberate, like the broom had followed me. My heart pounded as I got out of bed, barely daring to breathe, straining my ears to pinpoint the sound. It seemed to be coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom, moving slowly down toward the living room. I held my breath, listening to each gentle sweep, almost hypnotic in its rhythm. I gathered my courage, thinking I'd confront whatever it was, end this once and for all. But as I reached the doorway and peered into the dark hall, the sound stopped. I stood there, heart racing, every muscle tense, waiting to see if something would emerge from the shadows. But the apartment was silent. The next morning, I convinced myself that it was just a lingering memory, some leftover fear that my mind was clinging to. But as the days went by, the strange occurrences began again. I'd wake up to find books on the floor, stacked in neat piles in the living room, though I knew I hadn't touched them. Small objects, pens, keys, even my coffee cup, would move just slightly, shifting a few inches from where I'd left them. One night I came home to find a broom lying on my kitchen floor. I didn't own a broom. It was an old, worn thing, almost identical to the one I'd left in the house, with straw bristles and a wooden handle smudged with dust. I couldn't even bring myself to touch it. I left it there, thinking maybe I was imagining things, but I knew deep down it was real. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, every creak felt like a threat. And then, as if sensing my fear, the broom started sweeping again, its soft, haunting rhythm filling the apartment. I lay in bed, too scared to move, feeling that same oppressive cold I'd felt back in the house. It was as if something had latched onto me, refusing to let me go. I decided to seek help. I called Sarah, the one friend who knew about my experience in the house. She didn't think I was crazy. She listened patiently, and when I told her about the broom, the sweeping and the moving objects, she paused. "You know, maybe it's time to find out what they want," she said, her voice low. "They've followed you all this way. Maybe they're trying to tell you something." That thought filled me with dread, but I knew she was right. If I didn't confront whatever this was, it would never leave me alone. So the next night, I prepared. I set out the strange broom in the middle of the living room, and I sat down in front of it, waiting. My heart pounded, my hands cold and clammy as I spoke into the silence. "I don't know who you are or why you're here," I said, my voice shaking. "But I need you to stop. Please. I just want my life back." The apartment was silent. For a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. But then the lights flickered, and a chilling gust of air swept through the room, carrying with it a faint, whispering voice. "You left us." The words were barely audible, like a whisper in a dream, but they were unmistakable. I felt my throat tighten as the room grew colder. The broom began to move, slowly, sweeping across the floor as if guided by unseen hands. I sat there, too terrified to move, watching as it traced a path around the room, its bristles scratching softly against the floor. And then I saw it, a faint outline, almost like smoke, hovering just behind the broom. It was a figure, shadowy and indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and accusing. "Why did you leave us?" it whispered, the voice like wind through an empty room. I shook my head, struggling to speak, my voice barely a whisper. I didn't know." The figure moved closer, the room growing colder with each step. And then I understood. The journal, the symbols in the old house, they hadn't just been random markings or scribbles. They were signs, remnants of rituals the previous owners had tried to use to summon something. And I'd disturbed it, broken the fragile balance they'd created, leaving the spirits trapped and restless. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of sadness, as if I could sense their frustration, their longing to be free. And in that moment, I realized what I had to do. The next day, I returned to the old house. The new owners were kind enough to let me inside, probably assuming I'd left something behind. I went straight to the library, found the journal, and carefully traced each symbol with a piece of chalk I'd brought along, recreating them exactly as I remembered. It all started with a dare. My friend Mark had rented an old mansion outside town, one of those huge, eerie places people say is haunted. Mark wasn't one for ghost stories, so he brushed off the mansion's reputation, calling it all just rumors. But for me, the idea of an abandoned mansion, especially one with its share of ghostly tales, was enough to set my nerves on edge. That's probably why he dared me to explore it alone one night. "Nothing's going to happen," he laughed, "but if you're so curious, why don't you check it out for yourself?" I couldn't say no, so there I was, flashlight in hand, standing in the grand empty foyer. The place had that unmistakable stale scent that only old buildings seem to have. Everything felt still, yet I had the strange sensation of being watched. Trying to shake off my nerves, I told myself to get it over with. After all, the house was just an empty, creaky old building. What could go wrong? As I began exploring, I noticed odd details that only added to the eerie atmosphere. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist in the dim light, flickering in ways that didn't match my flashlight's beam. At one point, I saw what looked like a dark figure standing in the doorway to another room. I froze, heart pounding, but when I stepped closer, I found it was only the shadow of an old coat rack, its long, thin form looming like a figure in the dark. I laughed, a shaky sound that didn't quite match my relief. "This place is really getting to me," I muttered, trying to convince myself I wasn't spooked. I moved to the next room, which looked like an old library. The shelves were filled with dust-covered books, the spines faded and worn. Some were lying open on the floor, as if someone had been reading them and simply left in a hurry. I bent down to pick one up, but before I could reach it, I heard a strange sound, a faint scraping, like something heavy dragging across the floor. Instinctively, I whipped around, pointing my flashlight at the source of the noise, and that's when I noticed it. The fire extinguisher in the corner, a bright red that stood out against the dark walls, had somehow shifted several inches to the left. I was sure it had been in a different spot when I entered. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I just didn't notice where it was, I told myself. even though deep down, I knew I'd noticed it perfectly well. But as I turned to leave the library, I felt a chill run down my spine. Just past the doorway, I saw a shadow slip across the wall, as if someone or something was walking down the hall. My heart was hammering now. I knew I was alone, but the shadow had been there, clear as day. I hesitated, wondering if I should turn back, but a strange curiosity pushed me forward. Taking slow, cautious steps, I followed the hallway, moving toward whatever had cast that shadow. The hallway led to a grand staircase, the kind you'd expect to see in an old movie. It spiraled up, disappearing into darkness. As I stood there, shining my flashlight up the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from above. I considered leaving right then, but something made me stay. I had to know what was going on. I took a deep breath and started up the staircase. Each step creaked under my weight, echoing through the empty mansion. The higher I climbed, the colder it became, as if the air itself was growing heavy with something unseen. When I reached the top, I paused, my flashlight catching glimpses of old portraits lining the walls. Their eyes seemed to follow me, their expressions frozen in somber stares. I shuddered, hurrying past them. At the end of the hallway was a door slightly ajar. It was strange because every other door had been firmly shut. The sight of it made me hesitate, but again, curiosity got the better of me. I nudged the door open, and as I stepped inside, I was hit by the distinct smell of dust and something faintly metallic. The room was sparsely furnished, with an old armchair facing a large, dust-covered mirror. I shone my flashlight around, scanning the empty space, but as I swung the beam back to the mirror, I stopped cold. In the reflection, I could see the door behind me, and there, in the faint shadow, was a figure. It stood just behind me, a dark outline, still and silent. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. I looked back at the mirror, and the shadow was gone. A cold sweat broke out across my skin, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. But as I turned to head back toward the door, something caught my eye. The fire extinguisher was back, standing just beside the doorway. I knew for certain I hadn't seen it when I walked in. It was as if the extinguisher had followed me upstairs, moving on its own. Every instinct screamed for me to get out. I backed out of the room, barely able to tear my gaze from that strange, inexplicable object. My heart hammered as I descended the stairs, my footsteps quickening with every step. But even as I reached the bottom, that same shadow flickered in the corner of my vision, gliding down the hallway as if it were leading me out. The moment I reached the foyer, I broke into a run, throwing the front door open and stumbling outside. I didn't stop until I was clear of the mansion, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. Standing in the moonlit yard, I looked back at the house, half expecting to see that shadowy figure in one of the windows, watching me leave. The mansion was dark and silent, just as it had been when I arrived, but something was different now. I felt a lingering presence, a strange, unsettling energy, like the house was watching me. And as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still there, waiting for the next visitor, foolish enough to cross its path. The story I'm about to tell isn't easy to share. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you, lingering at the edge of your mind, like a nightmare you can't shake off. This happened a few years back, when a group of us decided to explore an old railway bridge tucked away in a quiet, eerie part of the Welsh countryside. We were just a bunch of friends with a taste for the mysterious, drawn to old, abandoned places and strange landmarks. But what happened that night left us shaken to our core, and none of us has ever been the same. It was late autumn, and the air was thick with that peculiar chill that seems to seep straight into your bones. Leaves crackled underfoot as we made our way down a narrow dirt path, overgrown and shadowed by tall, twisted trees. The path led us to the bridge, a massive, looming structure shrouded in mist. The railway was no longer in use, and the bridge was all but forgotten, covered in moss and ivy, like something out of an old ghost story. We'd heard strange tales about this place, rumors of disappearances and ghostly apparitions seen along the tracks, but we'd all laughed it off. Ghost stories were fun in theory, but none of us truly believed in them. As we approached, though, I felt the weight of the place settle over us. There was something dark about it, like the bridge itself was alive, watching us, waiting. The sun was already sinking, casting long shadows across the bridge as we made our way onto it. The quiet was unnerving. No birds, no distant hum of cars, just the soft sound of our footsteps and the occasional gust of wind that whistled through the bridge's metal beams. We walked single file, our voices hushed, each of us feeling the weight of the silence. As we reached the middle of the bridge, my friend James pointed out something strange near one of the support beams. A dark stain on the concrete, glistening faintly in the fading light. At first we thought it was just old water damage, but as we got closer, I felt my stomach twist. It wasn't water, it was blood. There was no mistaking it. The thick, crimson stains were fresh, streaked across the concrete like someone had been dragged. We all exchanged uneasy glances, trying to laugh it off, but the laughter was strained, hollow. I felt a chill settle over me, like we'd stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to see. "Maybe it's just some animal," Sarah whispered, though her voice shook. "It could have, gotten hurt and—" But even she didn't sound convinced. We stared at the stains, each of us wondering the same thing. What had happened here, and why? Just as we were about to leave, James spotted something else. A small, rusted door embedded in the side of the bridge, almost invisible under a thick layer of ivy. It looked old, ancient even, like it hadn't been opened in years. But the door was slightly ajar, as if inviting us in. Against my better judgment, we decided to check it out. Curiosity got the better of us, and one by one we squeezed through the narrow opening. Inside, it was dark, colder than the air outside. The only light came from our phones, casting weak beams that barely cut through the thick, suffocating darkness. The room was small and empty, except for a few scattered, broken bottles and what looked like old, decaying rags. But there was an odd smell, metallic and sour, like rust mixed with something far worse. The further we walked, the stronger the smell became, until I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. Then we saw it. Along the walls, smeared in dark, drying blood, were strange symbols. Circles, lines, and jagged shapes that made no sense, yet felt wrong. There was something almost alive about them, like they'd been painted with purpose, with intent. And at the center of the room, scrawled in large, shaky letters, was a single word that made my blood run cold. Leave. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I glanced at my friends. They looked as shaken as I felt. We'd all seen enough horror movies to know this was our cue to get out. James was already backing toward the door, muttering about how this was all a bad idea when we heard it. A faint, rhythmic thumping sound from somewhere deeper inside the bridge. We froze, exchanging terrified glances. The sound was coming from beyond a narrow tunnel at the back of the room, leading further into the darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out while we still could, but something held me there, like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape. The thumping grew louder, a steady, sickening rhythm that seemed to echo through the walls, filling the room with its relentless beat. I glanced at Sarah, her face pale in the dim light, and whispered, "We need to go, now." But just as we turned to leave, a new sound stopped us dead in our tracks. A low, wet scraping like something heavy being dragged across the floor. The sound came from the tunnel, slow and deliberate, drawing closer with each passing second. My heart pounded, my breath hitching in my chest as I stared into the darkness, straining to see what was coming. And then, just at the edge of the light, we saw it. A shadowy figure, hunched and twisted, dragging something behind it. It moved slowly, each step sending a wave of cold dread over us, like an invisible hand squeezing my heart. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't move, frozen in place as the figure lurched closer. Its face was obscured, hidden in shadow, but I could see its eyes, dark, hollow pits that seemed to stare straight into my soul. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if listening, then let out a low, guttural laugh that echoed through the room, filling the air with a sense of horror so deep I felt like I was drowning in it. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, slipping back into the darkness, leaving us alone with the echoes of its laughter and the bloodstains on the walls. We didn't need any more convincing. We turned and bolted for the door, scrambling out of that nightmare and onto the bridge, our breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. The air outside felt warmer, almost safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched, that something was following us as we ran. As we reached the end of the bridge, I glanced back, half expecting to see that shadowy figure lurking in the doorway. But the bridge was empty, silent once more, as if it had never held any secrets at all. You know that feeling when you're alone in a big empty building and everything around you feels just off? I used to brush it off as my imagination, but that was before I took that job in the old building on Jefferson Street. It's one of those old office buildings that probably used to look fancy in the 70s, but now it's just kind of run down and sad. My office was on the 4th floor, but a lot of the building was unoccupied. Most of the floors were empty or under renovation. My job? I worked late hours for a small data processing company. Mostly it was just me and a couple of other employees on my floor, so I was used to the quiet. But looking back, maybe I should have taken it as a warning. One night in early November, I was working late. I remember the wind that night. It was howling outside, rattling the old windows. Arizona doesn't get that kind of cold often, but when it does, it bites right through you. That's what it felt like, even inside the building. The kind of chill that settled deep into your bones, no matter how many layers you were wearing. I had just wrapped up some paperwork when I heard a soft thud. It sounded like it came from down the hall. Now, keep in mind, I was the only one working late that night. Most of the offices on my floor were empty, and the cleaning crew had already come and gone hours before. At first, I thought it might just be something mechanical, a loose window, maybe, or one of the many creaky pipes. The building wasn't exactly in top shape, but the sound didn't stop. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, almost like footsteps, but softer, like someone was trying to be quiet. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was just the building settling. But the tapping grew louder, then faded away, then came back. Against my better judgment, I decided to go out and take a look. I figured maybe someone else was working late, or maybe one of the security guys was doing their rounds. The hallway lights were dim, which wasn't unusual. They were always flickering, casting strange shadows on the walls. As I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoed, but each step I took seemed to be matched by another softer set, just slightly out of sync with mine. When I stopped to look around, the other steps stopped too. And when I turned, all I saw was an empty hallway stretching in both directions. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the wind outside seemed to have died down, leaving nothing but the eerie hum of the fluorescent lights. I forced myself to laugh it off, told myself I was just tired and that my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I turned to go back to my office, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting across the wall at the far end of the hallway. It moved fast, like it was in a hurry to get somewhere, but there was no one else around. I froze. It was just a shadow, but it looked wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but something about its shape and the way it moved didn't seem natural. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on where I'd seen it, half expecting it to jump out from the corner, but nothing happened. I took a deep breath, shook it off, and made my way back to my office. I tried to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and every time I did, I felt this weird sense of anticipation, like I was waiting for something to happen. Around midnight, I decided enough was enough. I packed up my things, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the elevator. But as soon as I stepped into the hallway, that tapping sound started up again, closer this time. And this time, it wasn't just a tap. It was a shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I picked up my pace, trying not to look back, but my heart was racing. The hallway felt endless, and the sound was getting closer. I told myself it was just the wind again, that old building noises were messing with me. But it didn't stop. It got louder, like someone or something was right behind me. I finally made it to the elevator and jabbed at the button, practically willing the doors to open. When they finally did, I stumbled inside and hit the button for the lobby. As the doors began to close, I felt this sudden urge to look back, and I wish I hadn't. There, standing at the far end of the hallway, was a figure. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, with long arms that seemed to stretch down to its knees. Its face, I couldn't see its face clearly, but I swear I saw two dark, empty eyes staring right at me. The thing didn't move. It just stood there, watching me as the elevator doors slid shut. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I was shaking, gripping the handrail in the elevator as it slowly made its way down. When I reached the lobby, I practically sprinted out of the building and into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the street, and even then, I didn't feel safe until I was back in my car with the doors locked. After that night, I couldn't bring myself to stay late at work anymore. I started leaving as soon as the sun went down, and I didn't talk about what I'd seen with anyone. I tried to convince myself it was just stress or a trick of the light. But every so often, I'd hear rumors from the other employees about strange noises, flickering lights, and shadows that didn't quite make sense. And one night, a few weeks after my experience, I bumped into the night security guard as I was leaving the building. He was an older guy, the type who'd seen it all, and I figured he'd laugh it off if I mentioned anything. But when I asked him, just casually, if he'd ever seen anything weird in the building, he got real quiet. Then he looked me dead in the eye and said, "I've worked here 15 years, and every night I pray that whatever's in this building leaves me alone." That was enough for me. I quit a week later. Got myself a new job in a modern office with plenty of windows and lights that don't flicker. But sometimes late at night, I'll find myself thinking about that shadow and those dark, empty eyes. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, whatever it was, still remembers me too. It's funny, no matter how hard I try to forget that place, it always seems to find a way back into my thoughts. Sometimes I even dream about it. I'll wake up, sweating, with images of that shadowed hallway, flickering lights, and those empty eyes burned into my mind. I guess that's how fear works, though. It leaves a mark, something deep, like a scar on your memory. After I quit, I didn't look back, at least not for a while. I kept my head down, threw myself into my new job, tried to rebuild a sense of normalcy. But as weeks turned into months, I found myself growing more and more curious. Part of me wanted closure, a way to understand what I'd seen, or maybe just prove to myself that it was all in my head. One Friday night, I was sitting at home, scrolling through old emails, and came across one from the security guard who used to work in the building. I don't even remember exchanging emails with him, but there it was, from years ago. A quick note confirming that he'd seen me leave the building after hours. I guess it was part of the protocol, having someone vouch that the place was locked up. It was strange, seeing his name again after so long. Made the memories feel fresh. And then, against my better judgment, I decided to reach out. I wrote a quick email, something simple, just asking how he was and if he still worked in that old building. I didn't expect a reply, honestly. I half wondered if he'd retired by now. But the next morning, I had a response waiting in my inbox. It was short, maybe only 2 lines. "I don't work there anymore. It's better if you stay away from that place. There's something wrong with it." Reading that, I felt a chill creep down my spine. But instead of taking his advice, like any sane person would, I found myself doing the opposite. Maybe it was stubbornness or curiosity, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that what I'd experienced wasn't real. So I started digging. I spent hours online, researching the building, its history, anything that might explain the weird things I'd seen and heard. And as it turns out, there was a lot I didn't know. The building had been around since the late 1940s, originally built as a bank before being converted into office space in the 1970s. There were plenty of records, articles about its construction, renovations, the businesses that had come and gone over the years. But there was one story that stood out, a report from the early 1960s. Apparently a bank employee had gone missing one night, just vanished without a trace. The last place she was seen was right there, on the 4th floor where I used to work. They'd searched everywhere, basements, rooftops, even the nearby alleys. But she was gone. No body, no trace, nothing. Just gone. The more I read, the more I felt a creeping sense of dread. It wasn't just her. Over the years, there were reports of people who'd seen strange shadows in the hallways, of lights flickering even when the wiring was checked and updated, of employees who'd feel an eerie presence late at night. There was even a rumor that one of the janitors had seen a face staring back at him from the 4th floor windows, long after the building had closed for the night. And every story, every single one, seemed to point back to that same hallway. It was unsettling, knowing I wasn't the only one who'd experienced something in that place. But the more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. I wanted to see it again, to prove to myself that it was all just stories, just rumors, and my own overactive imagination. So one night, just before midnight, I drove back to the building. It was stupid, I knew that, but I couldn't help myself. The parking lot was empty, of course, and most of the building was dark. They'd closed it down temporarily for renovations, but I knew that was just code for the place was too old and expensive to maintain. Still, I had a way in. The side door lock was old, and with a bit of force, I managed to get it open. Walking through those halls again was like stepping back in time. The air felt thick, almost like I was wading through it, and it was as cold as I remembered, maybe colder. The floors creaked beneath my feet, every sound magnified by the emptiness of the building. I made my way up to the 4th floor, taking the stairs slowly, each step echoing in the silence. By the time I reached the top, my heart was pounding, my hands clammy with sweat. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dimly lit by a single emergency light that flickered erratically, casting long shadows along the walls. I took a deep breath and started down the hallway. Everything was quiet. Too quiet. But as I neared the spot where I'd seen that shadow, I felt it. A prickle on the back of my neck, a sense that someone or something was watching me. And then, just like before, I heard it. The soft, shuffling footsteps, coming from somewhere just behind me. I froze, afraid to turn around. The footsteps got louder, closer, each step slow and deliberate, like whoever, or whatever it was taking its time. My whole body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it again. A shadow drifting across the wall, taking shape. It was taller this time, its limbs elongated, distorted, stretching impossibly as it moved toward me. I could feel the cold radiating off it, and in that moment, I knew that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. It was something else, something old, something that didn't belong in our world. The shadow stopped just a few feet away from me, and I could feel its gaze, heavy and piercing, as if it were looking right through me. Slowly, I forced myself to turn around, and for the first time, I saw its face. It was hollow, like a mask, with empty eye sockets and a mouth twisted into an unnatural, frozen smile. And as I stared into those empty eyes, I felt a wave of cold wash over me, deeper and more intense than anything I'd ever felt. I stumbled back, gasping, and that's when I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost thought I imagined it. But it was there, soft and raspy, like a voice carried on the wind. "Why did you come back?" Those words echoed in my mind, over and over, each one colder and darker than the last. I turned and ran, my footsteps pounding down the hallway, the shadow still lingering in my peripheral vision. It followed me all the way to the stairs, down each flight, until I burst out of the building and into the night. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, and even then I could still feel that thing watching me, its empty eyes lingering in my mind. I don't know what that thing was, and honestly, I don't want to know. I've done everything I can to forget about it, to pretend it was just a nightmare. But every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye, or hear soft footsteps in an empty room, and I remember that cold, hollow face. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, waiting in that dark hallway, waiting for someone else to wander in. Or maybe it followed me, lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting for the day I'll make the mistake of going back. And as much as I try to push it out of my mind, there's a part of me that wonders if I'll ever truly be free of it. Because once you've seen something like that, you can't unsee it. It stays with you, like a shadow you can't shake. And every time I think about it, I wonder, did I escape, or did it let me go?